Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking into something pretty disturbing.
Yeah.
It's a story about broken trust, corruption, and people who really needed help being left behind. We're talking about the disaster relief scam that hit Madhya Pradesh, India.
Right. And it's not just about the money that vanished, though that is a staggering amount. We're talking about 23.81 crore rupees, almost 3 million US dollars. It's about how this scam really impacted the lives of some of the most vulnerable people who had already lost so much in natural disasters.
It's heartbreaking, really. So I guess the big question is, how did something like this happen?
Well, to understand that, we need to understand a little bit about Madhya Pradesh itself. It's a state in central India, and it's incredibly diverse in terms of its landscape. But that diversity also makes it prone to a whole range of natural disasters. We're talking floods, droughts, intense lightning strikes, you name it, they've probably experienced it.
And I imagine that takes a huge toll on the people living there,
Hmm.
especially in rural areas. Absolutely. A large portion of the population relies on agriculture, so when a disaster hits, it can wipe out their entire livelihood. They have very little in the way of a safety net, so they rely heavily on government assistance to get back on their feet.
So that's where these disaster relief funds come in, right? It's money specifically set aside to help people rebuild their lives after these kinds of events.
Exactly. At the state level, there's the State Disaster Response Fund, or SDRF. And when a particularly large-scale disaster hits, the central government can provide additional support through the National Disaster Response Fund, or NDRF. In theory, it's a pretty solid system. The money is there, earmarked for specific purposes. But as we know, something went terribly wrong.
Right. And the scale of the scam suggests it wasn't just a case of mismanagement or a few bad apples. This was a systematic failure.
It really was. And you might think that something this big, involving millions of dollars, would require some sort of complex financial scheme, shell companies, offshore accounts, that sort of thing. But the shocking thing is, it was surprisingly simple.
Really? So they just walked in and grabbed the cash?
Not quite. But the methods they used were shockingly basic. They exploited loopholes in the system, taking advantage of weak oversight and a lack of accountability.
So how did they actually do it? What were these loopholes they were exploiting?
Well, one of the key methods was forging what are called sanction orders. These are the documents that authorize the release of funds for disaster relief. By creating fake sanction orders, they were able to create a paper trail that looked legitimate.
So they made it seem like the money was going where it was supposed to go, but it wasn't.
Exactly. And to make those fake sanction orders work, they needed fake beneficiaries. They fabricated names, sometimes even using the identities of deceased individuals to bypass any checks for actual victims.
It's sickening to think about stealing from people who are already suffering.
It really is. And the really frustrating part is that all of this was happening under the nose of the Integrated Financial Management Information System, or IFMIS for short. This was a system that was supposed to bring in more transparency to prevent this very kind of fraud.
And yet, it failed.
Ironically, yes. It seems the IFIS had its own vulnerabilities. The verification protocols were weak, allowing these fabricated transactions to slip through. And once those transactions were approved, the funds were simply diverted to personal accounts. In many cases, these accounts belonged to government officials or their families.
So to recap, they created fake paperwork, invented victims, exploited the system's flaws, and pocketed the money. It's almost unbelievable.
It is. But we can't forget that behind the numbers, there are real people who were deeply affected by this scam. We're talking about flood survivors, families who lost loved ones to lightning strikes or drownings, farmers struggling with drought. These were people who were already dealing with incredible hardship, only to be betrayed by the very system that was supposed to help them. To really grasp the scale of this, I think we need to look at specific districts where this scam had the most devastating impact.
Yeah, let's do that. Where did they see the most egregious misuse of funds?
Well, the Comptroller and Auditor General's report highlighted a few districts where the scale of the theft was just staggering. Sioni, for example, lost a whopping 11.79 crore rupees, mostly through fake claims for lightning, drowning, and even snakebite victims.
Snake bites. That seems particularly cruel, stealing from those victims. I know it's a big problem in rural areas, especially during monsoon season.
It is. Think about it. People are working in the fields, often in flooded areas, and they're incredibly vulnerable to snake bites.
Yeah.
To then fabricate claims and steal money meant for their treatment, it just adds another layer of tragedy to the situation.
It's awful. Okay, so Sioni was hit hard, but were there other districts where this was rampant?
Oh, absolutely. Shipur, for instance, suffered terrible floods in 2021. They were allocated 3.36 crore rupees in relief funds, but a huge chunk of that was diverted. Authorities managed to recover a small fraction, but the vast majority is still unaccounted for. And then there's Shivpuri, where drought relief funds were siphoned off. The exact amount isn't specified in the reports, but the impact on farmers who were already struggling with crop failures and debt was undoubtedly severe.
So we're talking about flood survivors without shelter, families grieving lost loved ones, farmers on the brink of losing everything, all because of a system that failed them in the worst possible way.
Exactly. And what makes this case even more disturbing is that this isn't an isolated incident from Madhya Pradesh. There's a history of similar scams, which suggest a deeper problem within the state's governance. We need to look at that history to understand how this could have happened and if there are any recurring patterns.
Right. You mentioned a couple earlier, the nutrition diet scam and the Viapam scam. Can you tell us a bit about those?
Sure. The nutrition diet scam came to light just a couple of years ago, and it involved a truly shocking amount of money. We're talking about 110 crore rupees that were meant to provide nutritional supplements to malnourished children. A vital program in a state with significant poverty. What's really unsettling is that the methods used were almost identical to the disaster relief scam. Fake beneficiaries, manipulated records, a complete disregard for the well-being of those who needed help the most.
They were stealing food from starving children. It's hard to even comprehend that level of cruelty.
I know. And then there's the Viapam scam, which was exposed back in 2013. This one involved rigging entrance exams for medical colleges and government jobs. So qualified students, hardworking individuals, were being denied opportunities because seats were being sold to the highest bidders. It was a massive scandal that implicated a vast network of officials, politicians, and middlemen.
Wow, so not only were they stealing from the most vulnerable, they were actively undermining the entire system of merit and fairness.
Exactly. And the Viapam scam, along with the nutrition diet scam and now this disaster relief scam, really paint a bleak picture of governance in Madhya Pradesh. It suggests that this isn't just a series of unfortunate events, it's a symptom of a much deeper systemic problem.
So it sounds like we need to dig a little deeper into those systemic failures. What are the fundamental flaws that allowed this to happen? How did a system meant to help people become a tool for such blatant exploitation?
That's a great question, and that's exactly what we're going to explore in our next segment. We'll take a closer look at the vulnerabilities of the IFMIS, the lack of transparency, and the culture of impunity that allowed these scams to thrive for so long. Because understanding how the system was gamed is the first step toward fixing it.
Right, because if we don't fix those underlying problems, this could just happen again. And that's a thought I don't even want to entertain. But we'll get to that in a bit. For now, let's take a quick break.
So we left off talking about how a system designed to be a lifeline for people in crisis was actually twisted into a tool for personal gain. It really makes you wonder, how could something like this happen?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about the IFMIS, the Integrated Financial Management Information System. It was supposed to bring more transparency and accountability to the process, right? The irony is kind of mind-boggling.
It is, isn't it? It's a classic case of good intentions, but the execution was clearly flawed. The IFMIS on paper should have made it much harder to pull off these kinds of scams, but it's like they built a high-tech vault but forgot to put a decent lock on it.
Okay, so the IFMIS was the vault. What were the specific weaknesses that allowed these scams to happen? Where were those flimsy locks?
Well, one of the biggest problems was the lack of proper identity verification. Think about those imaginary beneficiaries, the fabricated names, and possibly even using identities of deceased people. A more secure system would have had something like biometric verification, right? Something that makes it a lot harder to just invent a person.
Right, I mean, fingerprints, iris scans, that kind of thing. Those are pretty hard to fake.
Exactly. And then there's the whole issue of tracking the money. The IFMIS, at least in its current form, doesn't seem to have a very good way to monitor fund transfers in real time. So that means fraudulent transactions could slip through the cracks pretty easily. Think about it. If there was a system where every single transaction was logged and time-stamped, and you could trace it right back to the person who originated it, that would make it so much harder to just divert funds without anyone noticing.
That's a good point. It's like the difference between using a credit card and cash,
Yeah.
right? One leaves a trail and the other one doesn't.
That's a perfect analogy. And then on top of all that, you really need some kind of independent oversight. Regular, thorough audits by agencies that are completely separate from the government that could help catch these discrepancies, flag potential fraud before it gets out of control. It's like having an independent watchdog keeping an eye on things.
So better identity verification, real-time tracking of transactions, and independent audits. It sounds like a pretty solid set of safeguards. But even with all of that, there's still the human factor, right? I mean, someone, somewhere along the way, must have noticed that something was off.
That's where the whole culture of impunity comes into play.
Yeah.
It seems like the people who are orchestrating these scams really believed that they could get away with it. And, well, sadly, they were right, at least for a while. There's this lack of accountability, this sense that people in positions of power can basically operate without any real oversight or consequences.
And when you have that kind of environment, it just breeds more corruption. It's like a vicious cycle.
It is, and it's not just at the lower levels of bureaucracy either. Remember the Viapam scam? That one went all the way up to high-ranking officials and politicians. It showed just how deep the corruption ran in the state government.
So if we really want to fix this, it's not just about plugging the technical loopholes. It's about addressing this deeper cultural problem, changing the mindset that allows corruption to flourish.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's going to take a multifaceted approach. Alongside the technical upgrades to the IFMIS, we need to find ways to empower citizens to act as watchdogs. What if there were publicly available lists of beneficiaries? Or even better, an online platform where anyone could track how those funds are being used.
That kind of transparency would be huge. It would give people the power to hold their officials accountable.
Exactly. Imagine a website where you could see exactly how much money was allocated to your district, who the intended recipients were, and whether or not they actually received those funds. It would make it so much harder to divert money without getting caught.
It would also create a sense of ownership, wouldn't it? It would make people feel like they're active participants in the process, not just passive recipients.
Exactly. And beyond transparency, we also need to beef up the mechanisms for investigating and prosecuting these cases. We need a dedicated anti-corruption unit with real power, They should be able to conduct independent investigations without any interference from politicians.
So a financial watchdog with some teeth. I like the sound of that.
And it's not just about investigating, it's about making sure there are actual consequences for those who are found guilty. India's legal system is notoriously slow, often bogged down in bureaucracy. We need to streamline that process, maybe even create special courts specifically to handle these kinds of financial crimes. That way, justice can be served swiftly and effectively.
Because if there aren't any real consequences, the cycle just continues, right?
Exactly. And let's not forget about the victims. Any funds that are recovered from these scams should go directly back to the people who were supposed to benefit from them in the first place. It's a matter of restorative justice.
It only seems fair. Make them whole again.
Right. And it's not just about financial compensation. It's about acknowledging the harm that was done and taking concrete steps to make things right. And finally, we need to protect the people who are brave enough to speak up about these issues.
You mean whistleblowers?
Exactly. They're often the first line of defense against corruption, but they often face a lot of risks when they come forward. We need strong laws to protect them and a culture that encourages and rewards ethical behavior. We need to create an environment where people feel safe to report wrongdoing without fear of retaliation.
Okay, so we've talked about fixing the IFMIS, increasing transparency, empowering citizens, strengthening the mechanisms for investigation and prosecution, prioritizing the needs of the victims, and protecting whistleblowers. It's a pretty comprehensive approach, but is it realistic? I mean, can we really expect to see these kinds of sweeping changes actually happen?
It's tall order, no doubt about it. It's going to require a lot of political will, public pressure, and a real commitment to fighting corruption at every level. But I do believe it's possible. In fact, I think it's absolutely necessary if we want to restore faith in our institutions and make sure that the people who need help the most are actually getting it.
Because if we don't tackle these issues head on, the consequences are pretty dire, right? We've seen what happens when corruption takes root. People suffer, trust erodes, and it weakens the very fabric of society.
And this isn't just a problem in Madhya Pradesh. The vulnerabilities we've been discussing, weak financial systems, a lack of transparency, a culture of impunity, these are issues that we see in many parts of the world.
So this story, as awful as it is, can maybe serve as a wake-up call, a reminder that we need to be vigilant, demand accountability from our leaders, and hold them to a higher standard.
I agree. It's a reminder that the fight against corruption is everyone's responsibility. We need to be constantly vigilant, and we need to work together if we want to build a more just and equitable world.
It's definitely a heavy topic. We spent a lot of time talking about the problems here, but I think it's important to remember that there's also hope. We've touched on some potential solutions, and there are people out there working hard to make those solutions a reality.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to focus on in our next segment. We'll shift gears a bit and look at some of the more promising solutions that are out there and talk about how we can use technology, citizen activism, and a renewed focus on ethics to pave the way for a more accountable and transparent future.
So we've spent the last couple of segments digging into some pretty heavy stuff. A system meant to help people being exploited for personal gain. It can feel a bit overwhelming, to be honest. But I think it's time to shift gears a bit and talk about what a better future might look like. What are some of the things we can do to prevent these kinds of scams from happening again?
I agree. It's been a tough conversation, but I think it's important to remember that there's always hope. We've talked about the problems, the failures, the corruption, but there are things we can do. There are solutions out there, both technological and in terms of how we approach ethics and accountability.
Okay, I'm ready for some optimism. What are some of the most promising solutions you've seen?
Well, technology can definitely play a big role here. We've already talked about some ways we could strengthen the IFMIS, things like using biometrics to verify identities and having real-time tracking of transactions. Those would be big steps in the right direction. But it goes beyond just making the current system more secure.
What else can we do with technology? What are some of the more cutting edge ideas out there?
Well, one thing that have a lot of potential is blockchain technology. You've probably heard of it. It's this decentralized system where every transaction is recorded in a way that's transparent and virtually tamper-proof.
So it's like a public ledger that anyone can see. No more hiding in the shadows.
Exactly. With blockchain, you could track every rupee of those disaster relief funds from the moment they're allocated to the point when they reach the intended recipient. It would make it incredibly difficult to manipulate records or siphon off funds without anyone noticing.
That sounds amazing. Are there other ways we could use blockchain in this context?
Absolutely. We could even use something called smart contracts. These are basically self-executing contracts that use blockchain technology. So you could, for example, program relief funds to be automatically released to verified victims when certain conditions are met.
So you're taking the human element and the potential for corruption out of the equation.
Exactly. And with mobile technology becoming so widespread, we can even think about delivering aid directly to people through mobile wallets. It would cut out layers of bureaucracy, all those middlemen where things can get lost or skimmed off the top.
That would be a game changer, wouldn't it? Help goes directly to the people who need it.
It's a really exciting possibility. And it's not just a pipe dream. There are actually pilot projects happening all over the world that are testing out these very concepts.
That's good to hear. It sounds like technology can really make a difference here. But I guess it's only part of the solution, right? We also need to address those ethical failings, that culture of corruption that allowed this to happen in the first place.
That's a really important point. Technology can give us the tools, but it's ultimately people who are making the decisions. We need a real shift in mindset, a renewed focus on ethics and accountability.
That sounds great in theory, but how do you actually change a culture that's become so accustomed to corruption? It seems like a monumental task.
It is, no doubt about it. It's a long-term process, and it's going to take a multi-pronged approach. Education is a big part of it. We need to start teaching kids about ethics and civic responsibility from a young age.
Start from the ground up. Build a generation that doesn't see corruption as just the way things are done.
Exactly. And we need to strengthen ethical standards within government institutions. Mandatory ethics training for all public officials, stricter codes of conduct, and clear mechanisms for reporting and investigating wrongdoing.
Make it clear that corruption is not okay and that there will be consequences.
Right. And we also need to empower citizens to hold their leaders accountable. A free and independent press is essential for that, as well as strong protections for whistleblowers. And we need to encourage citizens to participate in the government decision-making process.
It's about creating a system of checks and balances, right? Where no one is above the law and power is distributed. It's a big challenge, but I am encouraged by the fact that we're seeing more and more people demanding accountability from their leaders.
Oh, absolutely. People are fed up with corruption, and they're not willing to tolerate it anymore. They're demanding transparency, they're holding their leaders to a higher standard, and they're using technology to amplify their voices and drive change.
It's a global movement, and it's gaining momentum every day. And I think that's what gives me hope. Even in the face of these really disheartening stories, there are people out there fighting for a better future.
I agree. This deep dive into the Madhya Pradesh disaster relief scam has been a tough one, no doubt about it. We've seen the ugly reality of corruption, the systemic failures, the devastating impact it has on people's lives. But I think it's also been a journey of discovery. We've learned about some really innovative solutions, And we've seen the power of collective action.
It's a reminder that even the most deeply entrenched problems can be solved if we have the courage to face them and the will to build a better world. A world where integrity and accountability aren't just buzzwords, but the very foundation of our society.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. And remember, change starts with each one of us. Let's keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep working together to build a more just and equitable world for everyone.